At the most basic level, a single-page application consists of an index file and a bundle of CSS, HTML, and JavaScript files. Single-page applications basically transfer the rendering of all the content from the server to the browser, and this is where we get our advantages, but we also get challenges there. Your more common multiple-page application website, they have a file for each page and part of the site. We just kind of include that all in one file. Single-page applications never have a page refresh. The page loads once and that's it. It kind of feels like a mobile app. Everything's snappy and pretty much instant. Angular JavaScript is Google's JavaScript structural framework, and it allows us to create a single-page application if you want. You don't have to. You can use Angular without creating a single-page application, but this is kind of, I was talking to a few people before this. This whole single-page application thing is a little experimental, and that's why AngularJS is so cool to use it, because Google's using AngularJS live on some of their websites. This framework utilizes HTML as a template language, and it extends that language to allow for succinct expressions of the different app components. Angular JavaScript is a complete client-side solution. So, like I was talking about, it takes the rendering from the server and puts it into the client. It's really perfect. It's really a perfect tool for leveraging RESTful APIs, which is what we're going to do today with the Wordpress Rest Api. The irony of this whole topic is that WordPress has been working on embracing the idea of client-side applications for a while, and this is apparent through the Wordpress Rest Api. This is a series of easy-to-use endpoints that you can access all of your WordPress data from. This allows us to dynamically populate a single-page application with WordPress data such as pages, posts. You can access all the user data, things like that. In my experience, the WordPress REST API is pretty much the fastest way you can access your data. It's all in JSON format, which is perfect for a JavaScript framework to handle. The WordPress REST API, one of the coolest things about it is that it can be extended. You can modify responses, create internal classes, you can add endpoints of your own, and you can access all the custom post types, taxonomy, and all that kind of stuff. So why single-page applications? Single-page applications do have a bunch of advantages over traditional multiple-page applications. To start with, they're really lightweight. Except for the initial load, which we'll talk about in a second, they are really lightweight. You don't have a ton of big files that you're loading in constantly. All this, creates a really snappy and seamless experience once the page is loaded. You can rapidly deploy a single-page application. You can actually use the same backend for a single-page application in the mobile app. They use the same concepts to communicate with servers. Single-page applications are extremely modular. This is my favorite part. You can pull pieces out, put pieces in, add pieces on. It's basically a bolt-on framework. Angular JavaScript specifically has really amazing unit testing features built in. It's easy to use for sure. So what are some of the challenges of a single-page application? It's important to note that a single-page application is not the answer for everything. They're not really great for games, GUI editors, or non-standard DOM manipulation. I talked a little bit about, or I spoke that the initial load time is longer than a traditional multiple-page application. That's because we're loading all the files when the page loads. So your initial load time is probably going to be a little bit longer. There are ways that you can get around this. And I'm not here to talk necessarily about how to get around those challenges, but know that you can do it. Also keep in mind that while the initial load time is faster, I think you more than make up with that in the speed advantages you get when the page is loaded. Going from one state of the application to another one is pretty much instant. Single-page applications require extra effort for SEO. This is the big question everybody will be asking, I would imagine. Considering that they consist of only one page that's rendered using JavaScript, it's rendered on the client, not the server, it's hard for bots to follow it. It's hard for them to index it sometimes. It's definitely not impossible. Google claims that with AngularJS, it's not a problem. In fact, they use AngularJS on a bunch of different sites. I think that single-page applications are how sites of the future will be built, and it's kind of already happening. The Weather Channel, Netflix, Lego, iStock Photo, all these people up here, they use AngularJS single-page applications. So let's jump into the meat of the topic, building a single page application theme for WordPress. I'm going to start by creating a WordPress theme that will host our single page application. Then we're going to go over the AngularJS single page application components. Then we're going to build the AngularJS single page application. The final part will be leveraging the WordPress Rest Api with our single page application to get WordPress pages posts. I'll show you those two specifically. Let's talk about the folder structure real quickly. Basically in our root theme folder, I always add two folders, an includes folder and an assets folder. Within the assets folder, we're going to have our app, our image folder. Those two, I'll come back to the app in a moment. Image is self-explanatory. I always have a folder for the different libraries and dependencies. And of course, we have CSS and JavaScript. Back in the root of the theme, we have our actual theme files, functions, header, index, footer, and of course, you need a style sheet. In the includes folder, I break apart the enqueuing of scripts because I want to be able to access that very quickly. Sometimes functions.php files can get really big, so probably not in this case if you're using a single page application. It's a very minimal theme, but just for good practice, I always break that apart. And today specifically, I'll be talking about that file in detail, how it applies to a single page application. I'm going to add a few libraries that I'll use. I always use Bootstrap. Most of you have probably heard of that. It's an awesome CSS framework. I just created a simple sizer CSS file is what we call it. It's not very descriptive, but basically it helps us size elements, static sizes, like a width at a certain number of pixels or something like that. As far as our JS files, we have a bunch of dependencies in here. We have Angular. We're going to use Angular sanitize, which is going to help us make sure that HTML is safe to bind with our view. UI route is an add-on for Angular. Basically, it leverages and makes better the built-in routing system. And then, of course, Bootstrap and jQuery. So to start with the functions.php file, this is a little small. That is why someone today told me they never use code samples, but too late for that. So obviously in our functions.php file, if you've never seen one of these, at the top we just have some information about our theme. This is where I require that enqueue.php file. Like I said, I break apart the enqueuing of styles and scripts. We're going to handle redirects with our single page application, so we're going to tell WordPress to not redirect. And before I go on any further, I should have talked about what the point of a functions.php file is. If you don't already know, it basically specifies our default behaviors of the theme. And so that's why we're telling our WordPress theme, don't do redirects. We're going to handle that with our single page application. Now in the header.php, this, as you can see, even though we're doing a single page application, we're still using the WordPress loop. We're not completely independent of that. So we have our header.php file. We obviously open our doc type, and then the first Angular stuff that's happening is, if I get the pointer to work here, is right up here. We start using some what are called custom directives. These are basically attributes that are specific to AngularJS. And this one here tells us that, or tells our single page application that everything within the HTML tag, it belongs to our single page application. Here we specify the name of our single page application. ngcloak is pretty cool because it'll prevent our expressions, which are snippets of code that we're going to put in here that'll be handled by our single page application. It'll tell our single page application to hide those until that variable is loaded. If we didn't do that, then you would see a brief flash of the variable name. I created this, another really well-named directive. This watches for a page resize, and if that happens, then it'll give our single page application some variables that tell us what window size Bootstrap is currently using. They use extra small, medium, and large. This is just an example of how you can leverage single page applications to help your site be more responsive. We have the head tag. That's pretty common. We're going to tell our single page application what the base URL is. This is so that we can handle routing and redirects in a moment. Here's another cool Angular directive. It's called ngbind. This is going to bind our title variable to this element. So in our single page application, we'll have a variable named called title, and we can bind that to this element so that if we update that, it'll dynamically update our site title. Here we have our fave icon. We're going to use a dynamic link, or not a dynamic, we're going to use I guess you call it dynamic. This root path here is going to be defined in our single page application. This is what the expressions look like, and this ng cloak will make sure that none of these are exposed in the view when you load your single page application. But we're using ng href, which is an Angular directive that will tell us we're using a variable in this URL. Lastly, on the header.php, we are going to specify where our header view will go. Single page applications have different views, which we'll talk about when we talk about Angular components, but for now we're just going to specify this as a placeholder where we're going to put our single page application header. Index.php is pretty much similar to any other theme. We get our header, we get our footer, and then right here we're going to specify a view for our content. Just like we specified a view for where our header will go, we specify here this is where content of the application goes. Think of this as where each page goes. Each state of the application will have a view that is displayed right here. Then we'll get the footer, which is hopefully pretty familiar. It's just closing body and closing HTML tags, and then we specify that this is where our single page application will place our footer. Our style sheet, this is required for every WordPress theme. This helps WordPress recognize the set of core theme files, the ones that we just went over in the last few that we'll go over in a second. That it'll tell WordPress this is a valid theme. This header comment up here gives WordPress information about our theme, kind of tells them, who made it, what the theme name is, things like that. I've only added 3 classes here, just for our purposes today. An active class, which will be applied to the current header link in the menu, in the navigation, to tell us, hey, this page is active. And then a card class to make our posts that we're going to display on the home state look kind of pretty. So now the enq.php. Like I said, I break this into a separate file instead of including the code directly in our functions PHP. We're going to add the action just like we would over in the functions PHP file. We specify the function we're using. These are the library scripts. We have jQuery, Bootstrap, Angular, Angular Router, that's our URL, and then Angular Sanitize. So these are all the app scripts that we're going to go over in a second. I have a naming convention, CTRL for controller, directive for directive, reserve for directive, things like that. This tells our WordPress theme because some of the files might be named the same, like Post.js, we have 2 of those. But this just tells us what the actual file is and what it's used for. Please note that these should all be concatenated, minified, and queued in production. We were talking about load times earlier with single page applications. If you have a million files like this on a row and you're queuing them, that will affect your load time. There are tools out there that can help you do this live as you're developing. I just wanted to lay these out like this today to show you kind of how it looks. And in a development environment, you would want these separate so that you can quickly edit parts of the site. But in production, these should all be concatenated, minified, and queued as one file. Now we have style sheets, where we use Bootstrap, that sizer class, or CSS style sheet I made, and then the theme style sheet. One other thing we're going to add in our enq.php is some localized variables. These are variables that we're going to expose to our single page application. Basically, they're WordPress variables. So for example, the get home URL is a WordPress function you can use to get the base URL of your site. This is so that you can install this theme on any site. You don't have any static URLs. So I have a root directory as well. That's just where that's the theme root, and then the templates directory, which is where our single page application will get its templates. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Now we have a nonce, or what WordPress would call that. It is a number used once. The irony of number used once is that WordPress, it's neither a number. So let's talk about the different components of Angular JavaScript. I've already talked about a few of them, but now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about each. So we have a view. This is a rendered part of the application, such as the header. We already talked about how there's a specified place for the header, specified place for the content, specified place for the footer. Those are each going to be what we call views. Views will belong to a state. This is a different part or page of the application. Not sure why. So next we have template. this is the actual HTML file that's associated with a specific view. I don't know where my mouse went, because I don't have my notes. Let's go back to where I was. Template. All right, so here's my template. This is the actual HTML file that's associated with a specific view. For example, the header and the footer views that we talked about, those will each have their own HTML file. The model, this is the data that's contained in the single page application. This is all the data data and functionality as well, it's not just data. But if the data happens to be manipulated in the view, it'll update in the model. And if it's updated in the model, it'll update in the view. And this helps us stay on a single page and not have to reload the page. So if we make an API request, and that request responds, we don't have to reload the page to display that information. Scope, this is the context where the model is stored and accessed. With single page application, well, in AngularJS, there are two contexts. There's the local, which is called scope, and global, which is called root scope. So you can expose things to the global application, or you can use things just in the local scope. Controller. This is the main logic behind each view. So basically, every view will have a template and a controller. And the controller is actually the logic behind it, all the functionality that you may have in that particular view. Expressions. We talked about this a little bit. Expressions are JavaScript-like code snippets in the HTML markup, and they're used to access variables and functions from the scope. A directive, this is an HTML extension, basically a custom attribute, and sometimes custom elements as well. An example of that would be the ng app that we talked about. That specified that our HTML tag, everything within that belongs to our single page application. Filters format the value of our expressions. A good example of this would be currency. You can have an integer that you want to display as currency. So in the expression, you would say that you're going to specify that there's a currency filter. That'll add the $ at the beginning and 2 decimal places at the end. You can make custom filters, which is pretty useful. Factories and services are reusable logic that's accessible to all controllers. You will inject these into every controller that you want. It's a factory service. It's just reusable things that you can use anywhere. The main difference between factories and services is how they're made. You can use them they're pretty much interchangeable. I'm not sure why Google made factories and service independent. But I'll go over examples of each a little bit later on. You'll see how they're different. And then we have a module. This is the container for the different parts of the app. Basically, this is a object, and all the other components of the app that we talked about are properties of the module. You can really structure your single-page application however you want. I just use a fairly standard use HTML retrieved by the Wordpress Rest Api. The config.js file is our app configuration. In the runtime order, this occurs after the app has been declared in the app.js and before the app actually runs in the run.js. This file is mainly used to specify our routing and URL settings. And we're also going to define an HTTP interceptor in our config.js so that we can make sure our nonce is applied to every WordPress REST API request. Just like we did with our module, we declare the app.config, we name it. Actually, no, we don't name this one, it doesn't need a name. And then we inject all of our dependencies. All of these belong to UI router. So, single page applications made with AngularJS. Alright, single page applications made with AngularJS use what's called a hash URL, hashbin URL, which would look something like yoursite.com /hashbin !/page name. I don't like that. I like HTML5 URLs, which is yoursite.com /page name. So to do that, we're going to remove the hash prefix, which is the exclamation point. So we just specify that it's going to be nothing. And then we enable HTML5 mode. I don't know why my mouse keeps disappearing here. And that one sounds a lot more fun than this one. So to set it up, we enable HTML5 mode. All right. Now, to specify what happens if a route can't be found in our single page application, we specify to return to the home state. Now we'll start setting up our different states. We have our root state. This will be applied to every other state of the single page application. This state will have two views, the header and the footer. So every other state of the single page application, which would be different pages in the application, will have a header and a footer. As you can see, we specify a template URL and a controller. So this is an example. This is our home state. As you can see, we make the parent root, and the URL is just /. That means this is just the base URL of our WordPress site. We're going to have one view, and we're going to specify it goes to the content UI view that we put in the index.php file. Then we specify our template URL as the home HTML. We're using here the localized variables we created in the nq.php file. And that's the localized dir templates. That's our templates directory. And we have home HTML, and then we specify the home controller, which is a file that we actually enqueued in our enqueue.js. Next, we have another one. We're going to be showing a contact page, or state, I should say. The parent, again, is root. Our URL is /contact. And we have the contact template as the contact HTML, and the contact controller as the contact controller. I'm going to make a post state as well. This is where you can click on a post and it'll take you to a page that will display each individual post. And then the last line of our config.js is where we define our HTTP interceptor. This will allow us to intercept our HTTP requests in real time, and we can add headers. We can also, that's the most common use, is to add headers to response before it leaves. And then you can also modify things that come back. You can do error handling and stuff like that. All right, the run.js file. This is where main initialization occurs. Unlike controllers, run does not have a local scope. It only has one, and that is the global scope. So you don't want to do much in here except for declare global variables. This is perfect for storing the localized variables that we created in enqueue.php so that we can use them throughout the rest of the single page application. All right, so we define the app as a JavaScript variable, and then we inject root scope. This is something you'll see on pretty much every single controller. We're going to specify, well, first we specify the root path. That's how we will find images and things like that in our views. Then on every other controller, we're going to specify a page index and a title for our website. Since this is the home, or this is the first time it's running, this is initializing, we just set the index to 0 and the root scope title to SPA theme, since that's what we called it. So every view is going to have a controller and a template. These together make up the view. The controller is the logic behind the view, and the template is the HTML. So let's talk about the header view that we injected in our header.php file. Again, we declare our controller, we name it, and then we inject root scope and scope. The only thing I have going on here is a jQuery function that will collapse our Bootstrap menu. For some reason, it wasn't doing that automatically. So, and this helps me illustrate a point. Is AngularJS uses JQLite. So if you want to use jQuery, you cannot use the $sign before your functions. You have to use the full word jQuery. This is the template for our header view. What we have, this is pretty standard Bootstrap navigation. Down in where we have, I can't get one. I guess I don't know PowerPoint as well as I thought. So here we have our image that's going to be in the header view, and we have a link. Instead of using an href, we're using a UI-sref. This is part of the UI router. When we click on this, this will just tell our single page application to go to the home state. ng source right here. Basically, the image won't show until the app is loaded, so we won't get a 404 not found. If you didn't use ng source and you tried to use an Angular expression right here, your site would throw you a 404 error in the console. Down here in the navigation, we use UI-sref to go home or contact. Those are the two states that we'll have that you can navigate to. I use one thing that I really like about Angular is you can do conditional classes. So if the page index that we talked about in the run.js file, if it equals 1, we'll apply that active class we created in our style.css. So depending on the current state, it'll show a cool bold link in the header. So this is what our header view will look like when we combine that controller and template. The home controller has a little bit more going on. Again, we declare our controller, we name it, and we inject root scope, and something new here, this is post. This is a custom service that we're going to create in a little bit to access posts from the Wordpress Rest Api. We're going to set a loading variable to true. We're going to say that this is page 1, because this is our home state, and we're going to say the title is spa theme home, so the page title will show that this is our home page. And here we leverage our post service that we'll go over in a minute. I'm not going to get too into detail on this, because we're going to go over that in a moment, but basically we call a function from our post service. We get the recent posts, and then if there's no errors, then we show those. This is the purpose of that loading variable. We're going to show this div if our single application is currently loading data. It's going to have a loading GIF right here. So if we're not loading data, then we're going to show our posts. This ng repeat directive right here is basically AngularJS iterating through an array and displaying a chunk of code for each object or each item in that array. So this is going to be each post that is retrieved. We're going to encapsulate that in a tag so that we can click on it. UI_sref right here again, this is the directive. This will help us click on that post and navigate to a page to show you that post. As you can see, that's why we use UI_sref instead of href, because we can pass in the post slug. And that's where our post service will reach out through the Wordpress Rest API, grab the post by the slug, and bring it back to display. ng-source, again, this is neat because you can do conditional expressions within it. We're going to show the post thumbnail unless it doesn't exist, and then we're going to show a placeholder PNG. So a lot of cool conditional things you can do with AngularJS. Down here, we're going to actually bind the HTML. So ng bind HTML, this is the post date. Here's the filter. This will show our date not in a PHP variable. It'll actually show this as a pretty long date. Then we bind our post title and a post excerpt. And this is what it'll look like. When it uses the post service, it'll pull a post out and display it. It'll actually show more than one. I just wanted to use one for illustration. And you can see that it has that cool little card class from our style CSS. Now let's talk about the footer. There's like nothing going on here. It's just going to show some HTML. So we just declare this footer controller, we name it, and then we inject root scope and scope. I don't actually have any functionality going on here, but you could if you wanted to. This is a standard footer template that you would see in most sites, and that's what it looks like as a view. Put all three of those views, the header, home, and footer together, and this is what you would get. So we have the site, and put our header up here. We pull in posts right here. If we were actually if this was an actual live site, it would show 6 or however many you specify right here, and then we have the footer. I'm going to go over directives really quick. Directives, we've seen a bunch of those already. They possess the ng prefix. We saw ng app, ng if, ng source, ng href. These are just the directives that allow you to extend the HTML syntax. AngularJS allows for the creation of your own. As I said, I created one that gets the current screen width in relation to the Bootstrap column sizes. So we'll just take a quick look at that. This is what a directive basically looks like. We declare it, we name it, we inject the window dependency, meaning that we're going to use that window object. We're going to return a scope, and this scope will become part of the scope that called it. So if you're on a state, this scope will merge with that state. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of what's going on here. It's pretty standard JavaScript where we just check this is Angular right here. We bind the window resize event to call a function. We have our function here which gets the window width, calls another function, which compares that width against what Bootstrap would consider a different column size, and then down here we set a boolean to those different column sizes. So in your application, as long as they're injected, like we saw with the home controller, we injected the post, that was actually a service, but you can inject factories the same way. You can define your own factories. The one that we use here, we defined this one in the config file to intercept HTTP requests. Just like everything else so far, we declare it, we name it, and we inject a dependency. In this case, this is queue. This is AngularJS's asynchronous service. Now, we're going to create a function to modify all of our outgoing requests. We're going to take in the request configuration. and add that localized nonce that we created in the enqueue.php file. Keep in mind that if you are making API requests to something other than the WordPress REST API, you probably don't want this going out to other APIs. So in here, if you were going to be making other requests, you would do that conditionally. You can also modify the response for request errors, responses, and response errors. Services are very similar to factories. I still haven't figured out exactly what the exact difference is, except that they're built differently, and Angular themselves, or Google themselves, uses them for different things. They always use a factory for your interceptors, and they usually use a service to interact with an API. They're very similar to factories. Again, modularized global functionality. Built-in services would be HTTP, location. We already saw window. We saw scope and root scope would be different. Would be a model of services. And then the queue for the async would also be a service. You can define your own services, and again, that's a really good way to leverage the WordPress REST API. The WordPress REST API. This is we'll just look at a few examples real quick to start off with. Basically, yoursite.com/wp-json/v2. This is the same for every WordPress site. Now, if you add pages to the end of that, you will get a JSON object of all the pages on your site. If you add a parameter called slug and give it a value, then you will get that page by slug if it exists. The same thing applies to posts. You don't just have to use slug. You can use one of many things. You can use ID. You can just give it a number and it'll return that number of posts or pages. However, if you just do posts by ID or slug, it's not going to have any linked data. You have to add the embed flag in there, as you can see down here. What linked data is, if you do have linked data, you will have the author name, you'll have their bio, you'll have their website URL. If you don't, it'll just be the indexes of those in the WordPress database. All right, so I'm going to give you an example of retrieving a page. I just added this real quick into the page for this example. I just have an H3 tag with explaining what's going on. Please fill out your contact info. And then I have a contact form 7 short-coded that. And this is actually in the WordPress admin. I created a page with this in there. And contact form 7 is one of my favorite contact forms. Now we're going to create a service, just like everything else. We declare it, we name it, and we inject the HTTP and then SCE. HTTP is the built-in Angular function for, or service for making requests, and SCE is for our ng sanitize. We're going to have a function called getSlug. This is going to return a page by slug. We define our request. It's got a method, which is get, and a URL for our WordPress REST API. We're going to create a promise. This means that in our controller, we will wait until we get a response before we do anything else. Once we get the response, we're going to build a page object. And we will return that page to the promise. And then we will return that promise back to the controller. Over here, we do the same thing that we did everywhere else. Loading variable to true, page number, title. We call our getSlug function. And then right here, we wait for that promise to return to us. As long as we don't have an error, then we set the variables for the page content and set our loading to false. In the template, if we're loading, then we show the loading GIF. If we're not, then we're going to show the page title and the page content in the page. And this is what it would look like. So this is how we retrieve a page through the WordPress REST API and show it in our single page application. The same thing goes for posts pretty much. We're going to do a getSlug function as well. We have our request, we create our promise. Then once we have a response, we structure that post to return it in a way that's pretty for our single page application. And then we return that post to our promise, and we return the promise to our controller. Here we define another one. This is for the home page where we get recent posts. It's pretty much the same, except that it's going to return the array of posts that we saw on the home page. I created a format date function. It's just it is a standard JavaScript function, pretty much for formatting a date retrieved from the PHP data or from PHP from our database. This creates it a little bit more pretty and returns it to our controller. So we define our post controller. We name it and we inject a few things here. our post service that we just created. These are the standard variables that we declare on every controller. The only one that's different is we use the state params, which is our UI router, and we get that slug. When we run the home page and we click on a post, it passes in a slug parameter. We have to get that so that we can use post get slug and pass in that slug. I'm running out of time, so I'm going really fast here. Once we get that post back, we check to make sure there's no errors, and then we create an array for our template to iterate through. That was on the home page where we did that. This is actually where we display one individual template or one individual post. If we're loading, we show the loading div. If we're not, then we show the post right here. So we have our post title, we bind our post date, post author, and our post content to the template. And this is what it would look like. This is just a sample. This is the Hello World post that comes with every single WordPress installation. So that was incredibly fast to go through that last little bit. So what I will say is I do have the source code for all this that I created, so you can get started playing around with it and start making your own single page application themes. I also have a template for plugins, so you can make a single page application plugin, which is also pretty cool. It's probably the best use case for single page application at this time is for a plugin. If you would like access to those, please come see me in the lobby. I'll be there for the rest of today and tomorrow. And